I'm Chris Sharon again, and I have the honor of directing the Faith as a Way of Life program at the Center for Faith and Culture, which is a program that works with pastoral leaders, congregational leaders, to try more effectively to connect faith to everyday life, to the different spheres of life in which we live, including the sphere of politics, the sphere in which our speaker now, Tony Hall, has spent a significant piece of his life. So I very much enjoyed reading his book on this issue of hunger and poverty. And I brought mine so he would sign it. But I wanted to suggest it to you partly because it's so directly on the topic of our conference, and because from his long experience working very hard on just this issue, it's the kind of book that when you read it, you know that the person is speaking from deep experience. So I wanted to bring that and hold it up and show it. I'm very delighted to ask Richard Jacob, who's the Associate Vice President for Federal Relations at Yale University, to introduce Ambassador Hall. Richard came to Yale in 1995 from Stanford, where he'd been in a senior leadership position in the School of Medicine. And here he's been the liaison between Yale University and the federal government on very many issues, from questions of student loans and the kinds of legislation that affects student loans to research concerns that the university has, and all manner of other things, including even coaching faculty as they go to do what Susie does regularly, which is testify in congressional hearings. He holds a Master of Arts in Public Policy from the University of Chicago and did his undergraduate at Oberlin College. He is someone who, in the senior leadership of the university, has a deeper appreciation and more lively appreciation for all the complexity that Tony Hall dealt with in his many years in Congress. And so I now ask you to join me in welcoming Richard Jacob to come and introduce our speaker, Tony Hall.
Thanks very much, Chris. It is certainly my pleasure today to introduce Ambassador Tony Hall. And I suspect that many of you already know much about Ambassador Hall's long involvement in public service, especially his singular dedication to alleviating poverty and hunger. I almost hesitate to review his accomplishments because I doubt that I will be able to do justice to them. Shortly after graduating from Denison University, Ambassador Hall served in the Peace Corps in Thailand in 1966 and 1967, where he taught English. And not long after returning to the United States, he was elected to the Ohio State Legislature, where he served in both the House of Representatives there as well as the State Senate. He was elected to the United States Congress representing Dayton, Ohio in 1978, where he was re-elected 11 times, which is a record for that district. The ambassador built an impressive record during his tenure in the House of Representatives. He found a renewed faith, which led him to focus his energies on hunger throughout the world. He co-founded the Select Committee on Hunger and chaired that committee from 1989 to 1993. He traveled to countries where suffering is widespread: Ethiopia, Sudan, Romania, North Korea, among many others. He wrote legislation to address poverty in poor countries and intervened to protect the women, infant, and children's feeding program here in the United States. When his colleagues abolished the Select Committee on Hunger in 1993, the ambassador protested with a hunger strike that lasted 22 days. Hundreds of his constituents marched in support and also gave up meals of their own. Before he left Congress, he had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times. In 2002, President Bush appointed him the United States Ambassador to the United Nations Agencies for Food and Agriculture. As he left the House of Representatives, many of his colleagues spoke in tribute to him. Among them was Congressman Frank Wolf of Virginia, who had traveled with the ambassador on many of those international trips, who said, "Tony is one of the most decent, sincere, dedicated people that I know." During his service as ambassador, he was a vigorous and outspoken advocate for the poor. In his book, Changing the Face of Hunger, which is published this spring, the ambassador lays bare the horrible reality of the scope of human suffering. He exhorts all citizens to bridge political, social, and religious divides, to work to relieve human suffering. He has devoted more than 2 decades of his life to breaking the persistence of poverty. I look forward to hearing his advice about how wealthy nations can give the world's poor a seat at the table. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Hall to Yale.
Well, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here, an honor to be with so many distinguished people that are not only speakers, but people in the audience that are connected because they're people of strong faith, or they're people that are connected with NGOs and the great work that they have done. I've had an interesting career. You heard part of it, that I was in the Peace Corps for 2 years, and I was in the state legislature for 10, and a U.S. congressman for 24, and an ambassador for 3.5 years, and it's almost 40 years. I don't look that old, do I? I mean, I feel good, but that really kind of makes me old. But you know, you can be humbled in these positions, and I find by being a congressman, you get humbled quite often. I remember the first time I was running for office, first time I was running for Congress, and I had a really strong opponent, good man, articulate. We had something like 30-some debates, and it was a hard-fought campaign, and it was my first time on the national scene, and it was towards the end of the campaign season, and we had about 2 weeks left, and it looked like I was going to win, just barely win, and one of my aides came into a room. I had all my supporters in a room. We were talking about the final 2 weeks, and he said, "Tony, you're not going to believe this, but Time Magazine is on the phone, and they want to speak to you." I'm thinking, Time Magazine, oh, I've arrived, I'm ready. Okay, get their number, get their phone number, get their name, I'll call them back. And I'll call them back in 10 minutes. So I got my group together, and I said, look, this will be my first time I've ever spoken to a national audience. I want to be sure that I say this right. And these are 3 things I want to say. And they said, beautiful, wonderful, sounds good. So I said, all right, let's get that person back on the phone. So we got the person from Time Magazine back on the phone, and I said, here it is, I'm ready. And she said, Tony, would you be renewing your subscription to Time Magazine? It's very embarrassing, very humbling. I've had the chance as a U.S. congressman and as an ambassador to travel to well over 120 nations. I've been to North Korea 6 times, and the Congo and Darfur, and you name it, I've been there. Recently, I was in Ethiopia, again, probably for my 12th time, and where 7 million people are at risk, and this means that 7 million people are at risk of starving just in one country. And this is one of the better years for Ethiopia. This is one of the better years because normally there's 15 to 16 to 17 million people always at risk in Ethiopia. And on a good day or a good year, they can only feed, if they have a great harvest, they can only feed about 3/4 of the people. I cannot tell you how many people that I saw suffering, orphans, because of their parents dying from HIV/AIDS and I think, as Ted said, he brought out these statistics about the numbers of people that suffer so much in the world today. And just briefly, as you know, before the day is up, 25,000 people will die today. And 25,000 died yesterday, and it'll be the same tomorrow. 2 billion people, almost 3 billion people, actually live on less than $2 a day. But in my own country, here in America, we have 30,000 people here. Or I'm sorry, 30 million people in this country that go to bed sometime during the month, maybe 2 or 3 days without food, because they live on fixed income, because they might be elderly. As a matter of fact, most are elderly, most are women and children. They make up the bulk of the combination. And what happens after they pay their health care bills, after they pay their utility bills, after they pay their daycare center, et cetera, 2 or 3 days out of every month, they have to run to a food bank or soup kitchen because they run out of money. And this happens to at least 30 million people in this country. So what does the Lord say about this? Well, you've heard some of the scripture. I think the Lord, when he talks to us about this, it's a mandate. He wants us involved with the poor. He wants us involved with the sick. There's over 2,500 verses in the Bible that deal with the issue of orphans, the people in prison, the hungry, the elderly, the alien, over and over and over again. And I have a number of verses here that I won't read, but the ones that I really seem to be drawn to are the ones in Proverbs where it says, in chapter 14, it says, those who are gracious to the poor, they honor me. And then it says in 19, those who give and help the poor, lend to me. And God doesn't say that many places in the scriptures that you can actually do something for him. He's always doing for us. He's always reaching out for us. He's always talking to us. He's always leading us, giving a good example. But he said, if you are gracious to the poor, you honor me. If you are good to the poor, you lend to me. I love those verses. And God is pleased with us when we do this. He won't forget. I had to actually go to the Congress of the United States to find God. Now, normally, yes, I know, people are laughing and smiling and giggling, but I had to go to the Congress of the United States to find God. And I found him in this person of Jesus, and I was actually pretty sick of my life up till then. I had been very ambitious and very successful, and I had achieved a lot in a very early number of years, and but I was living in this vagueness. And when I became a believer, I was amazed at how many people reached out to me. I know that you read so much about the partisan or the lack of bipartisanship in the Congress, maybe people that are involved in scandals, the meanness that are in campaigns, but I have found that there are members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, that meet, they pray together, they read the scriptures together, they do it quietly, they don't brag about it. Their families know each other. My best friend in the Congress is a man by the name of Frank Wolf. He's a conservative Republican. I'm a Democrat. And for years, we have met together. And I find when we do this, when we reach across party lines, economic lines, when we do this, it's a little bit hard, especially in the Congress of the United States, when you pray in the chapel right off the floor of the House, to come back into a debate and get up and blast your opponent or even blast the other party. I find that what Paul says to us as we travel together, as we work together, as we pray together, Paul in the chapters in 2 Timothy said that as he was writing to the Thessalonians, as he was saying, when Timothy and Silvanus and I came, three things happened. We had conviction, and the Holy Spirit was with us, and we had power. And I find that as believers, as we work together and as we talk together and as we go places together, and one of the places I went to before the war was Iraq. I didn't go there because of the war. We weren't in a war. I went there because of the humanitarian situation, and I wanted to see what I could do about it. And when we got there, everybody in Iraq that we met with was trying to lead us astray, was not telling us the truth. But the fact is, when we left, people started to cry because they didn't want us to go. Not because we have sparkling personalities, but because of the power and the strength of when you go 2 by 2, the faith and the strength of it was just incredible. And I find that every place I go, I find that so very few people know about some of the things that go on in the Congress and in the Capitol. And people always laugh when I said I have to go to the Congress, or I had to go to the Congress to find God. I'll never forget. It was shortly after I had been there about one term, and I was introduced to this group by a colleague of mine, a friend, and he said, I want to introduce Tony Hall to you. He's a U.S. congressman, and he's a Christian. And it was an interesting audience because people started to giggle and laugh, and an older man down front, he couldn't take it much longer. He was squirming, and he finally burst out. He said, make up your mind, buddy, you can't be both. But the fact is that there are a lot of good things that happen in Washington that I want you to know about, and it works. I've always had some friends that have been very good mentors of mine that have taught me a lot, that came in and spent a lot of time with me. And one of the first mentors I had, he came in, and we would read the scriptures and talk with each other, and I'd ask him a lot of questions. And he said, after about a year and a half, he said, Tony, isn't it time you start to bring God into your workplace? I said, how do I do that? I don't want to wear God on my lapel here. I certainly don't want to shove him down people's throats because people will run. But I want to demonstrate him in a way, I would like to show him in a way that I feel comfortable with. And not long after that, I had become the chairman of the Select Committee on Hunger. And in 1984 is when we had this amazing famine, this terrible famine in Ethiopia. And I went as the chairman of the committee representing the Congress and our country, and I think I was the first elected official to go. And my life changed on that trip. As a matter of fact, the first day that I was in country, I went about 250 miles north to a place called Coram and another little town called Alamata, and it was a World Vision compound, and they had partnered with Sisters of Charity. And as soon as I got there, I noticed thousands of people had gathered. When I went into the compound, a doctor grabbed me and he said, Congressman, would you come outside with me, because there are thousands of Ethiopians that have arrived here with their children, and we can only take 5 out of these maybe 3,000 Ethiopians are there. And so I went outside with him, and they thought that I was a doctor, and so they'd hand their child to me and saying in their language, please take my child, because they knew that we could only take 5 or 6, maybe 7 max. The rest had to die. And then I went up country about 2 hours after that, and thousands of Ethiopians had been walking because they had been hearing that the Red Cross was coming, and they had blankets and water and and food, and the fact is that there were 50,000 Ethiopians that had walked for well over 100 kilometers. They had sold everything to get there. They had nothing, and there was no Red Cross. There was no nurses. There was no blankets, food, or water. And they all laid down and they died. And I walked through that. And I can't tell you how many children I saw in a matter of minutes. I never got over that. And it just stung me. And I remember coming home on the plane from Ethiopia. I remember what my friend had said, don't you think it's time you start bringing God into your workplace? And this is what I felt. This was the way I felt that I could demonstrate my faith. I could bring him in by working on these kind of issues that were to help people, to try to keep people alive. And we do so many things in Congress in our life that mean nothing. As Carl Jaspers said, we kind of walk around and nothingness often. In my life in Congress, I wanted it to count. And this was the way that I felt that I could demonstrate my faith. So I began to travel the world and go every place that would receive me and legislate in Congress and do the kinds of things that I felt we needed. And so we started the Child Survival Fund, and I was the major sponsor of it. And we started basic education for women, and we started microfinance. First $25 million bill came out of the House of Representatives. And a number of other programs. And as I began to travel the world, what happened is my district of Dayton, Ohio, that's what I represented all those years as a state senator and now as a congressman, they began to write me letters and saying, you know, Tony, you care more about Ethiopia or Kenya or Ghana or wherever than you do Dayton, Ohio. Who needs you? Why do we need you? Because if you're going to spend your time in another country and you're going to travel around the world doing good things, which we respect, I mean, who's representing us at home? Well, I knew that they were wrong. I felt that they were wrong. But the perception was that their congressman, me, Tony Hall, didn't represent them very well. I got my staff together. I said, look, and this was a big lesson. And some of the questions that have come up here in the last day and a half address this question. How do we get people motivated? How do we bring this issue home? And I had decided, I told my staff, I said, look, we have got to find a way to bring this issue home. We've got to educate my district. We've got to educate Americans. And so what we did is we started many programs to build our constituency. And the first program we started, we borrowed something from World Vision. We had a 40-hour fast, and for every hour we fasted, we'd raise, maybe students would raise a quarter, $1. I would get businesses and corporations to back me, and we had about 4,000 people that fasted for 40 hours. We raised, I believe, about $280,000 over the weekend. We brought African ambassadors in to explain about the famine that they were going through. The important thing is not so much the money, but the number of people locally that were now responding to our call. And half the money that we raised of the $280,000 stayed in Dayton, Ohio, Montgomery County, and went to the 66 food banks and soup kitchens that we had there. So we kept a good portion of the money, and if you wanted your money sent to Ethiopia through the Jewish Relief Group, fine. World Vision, CARE, Oxfam, wherever you wanted it, we'd send it there. It was the start of building the constituency. Then we did a gleaning program. I think somebody was talking about gleaning here today, about the corners of the field in Israel, which they still have that law in place today. Well, we started that in Dayton, Ohio, and we asked farmers if we could go in and pick their produce. There's 110 million tons of food that goes to waste every year in America. 110 million tons of food goes to waste every year in America. And we don't get it. It doesn't get picked, or it rots, or it gets thrown out by groceries. It spoils on the way to various destinations, and so we started a gleaning program. And I asked one of the farmers, I said, one of the farmers, I was in the field with him, he said, well, why would you, I said to him, why would you give us this whole field of corn? He said, well, he said, this corn is imperfect, and he would take us, he would show me, and he would take the leaves off the corn, and there might be 2 kernels missing. He said, Americans buy perfect corn. They're not going to buy this very ugly corn. And this was perfectly good corn, of which he said, if you don't take this, I have to plow it under and let the crows eat it. And this happens all across America. So we started a gleaning program, and that built another constituency because we got churches and synagogues and all kinds of groups involved, and thousands of people going out into the fields and picking produce when these things had to be harvested. Then we started a senior citizen feeding program during the cold winter months. We started a pickup of food because now I'm getting known as the kind of the guy that's trying to do something about hunger. So what happened is the hotels began to call me, and country clubs, and my big military base of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and all the places that cook a lot of food but also throw out a lot of food, and said, Tony, we want to give you this food, but how do we do this? And so, to make a long story short, a friend of mine who is in the business of, he was in the linen business, he called me up because he heard me on a radio talk show talking about this, and he was a friend, and he said, look, I got 20 trucks. He said, I go to all these country clubs, these military bases, these restaurants. He said, look, if they're willing to give me their surplus food, I'll bring it into a central warehouse, and so he started that. And he got so excited about it that he went to his national convention of linen people, linen laundries, and they started to do it in Denver and Philadelphia and other places like that, started their own project. These are all private programs. And this was a way now that I could bring the issue home of hunger and humanitarian aid. I didn't have to say that I was a Christian. I didn't have to say I was a believer, because most people would come up and say, why do you do this? And then when they do that, you tell them. I'd rather, as some of you were saying today, I'd rather see a sermon than say one. And that's what I was trying to demonstrate. But the important thing is it now built a constituency. And when I first ran for office, I ran a poll that said, rank these issues from 1 to 25. Most important, number 1, least important, number 25. Deficit, jobs, employment, war, whatever. Humanitarian aid, foreign aid, last. When I first started. When we got done with all these programs, 24 years later, we did another poll. How do you rank these things? Humanitarian aid, hunger, 1, 2. Because we informed, we led, we educated, we touched people's hearts. You want to get a politician involved? I heard a missionary talking last night about some of the things that he was frustrated with. You want to get politicians involved, people, you got to take them and show them. You got to take these politicians and you got to grab them, you got to go speak to them, and you got to put them on the spot. You got a food bank or a soup kitchen in your church, bring them there. You want to show them poverty? Take them to India. Take them to Ghana. Take them wherever you can. Touch their heart. I can't tell you how many times we've taken members of Congress overseas to show this, and their heart is absolutely touched. And they come home and they become not only better citizens, they become better representatives, and they figure out what's going on in their own hometown. Because once you touch a person's heart, you don't have to really teach them much, because people are pretty smart. These people that do microfinance all over the world, these are smart people. You don't have to teach them so much. Give them a little bit of leadership. And I found that with my colleagues. So we really have to do a much better job of educating our public, because they don't know. What you're hearing this weekend from all these different speakers, and that 25,000 people are dying every day, and half the people in the world live on less than $2 billion a day, and they're microfinance, and most people never heard of this. But you are enlightened people, and sometimes we end up talking to the same people. And the point I'm trying to make is that we really need to educate, we really need to touch people, and you can go to you're all voters, you can go to your congressman, your governor, your mayor, and you say, what are you doing? What are you doing on hunger? What are you doing for the poor? And take them and show them a program. Because the one thing a politician responds to is that people can vote for him. And there's not a lot of people in Washington. You know, the Bible says that the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. There's not enough workers. It's a real problem, not only in the political ranks, but in the spiritual ranks. The workers are few. So if you go to Washington and you talk to these people, you can help change them. And I just remember what my book talks about, changing the face of hunger. I tell the story about, about the time I was with Mother Teresa. I had the chance to maybe meet her 6 or 7 times, and one time I was in Calcutta with her, and we were walking down the street, and I said, where do we start? Look at all the people that are living on the street, the people that are sick and hurting. I mean, how can we possibly get our arm around this and embrace this? And she said, well, she didn't say anything. She actually went in front of me, picked up a man who was sick, took him home, began to take care of him, wash him and clean him and love him and hug him. She always hugged everybody, embraced everybody. And her point was, do the thing that's in front of you. In New Haven, we got a lot of things right here. We want to mobilize the students here in Yale. I suspect there's a lot of good programs here, but there's a lot of things we can do here. We don't have to go to Washington, D.C. or North Korea. Another thing, just when you're feeling frustrated and nothing's going on, this reporter asked Mother Teresa once, she said, don't you think what you do is a drop in the bucket? And she said, no, it's really a drop in the ocean. She said, but if I don't do it, it'll be one less drop. And that's the way I feel. Each one of us does our little drop, does our little thing. And I think that's probably all I'll say, Chris, right now, and give all of you a chance to maybe ask questions or make statements, whatever. I'll be glad to try to answer them. Thank you.
Given so much of your life to government service and influence to public policy, do you think there is a gradual shift going on when foreign aid will not substantially increase, but more and more philanthropy and NGOs and private gifts will begin to take its place?
Well, the private giving is really starting to take off, and unlike any time that I can ever remember, and that's wonderful. Government still needs to play a role. And as you know, and I'm sure all of you will know, that our percentage of foreign aid really going to what we talk about, humanitarian aid, is extremely low. And that's never going to change until we become better advocates. We put senators, congressmen, governors on the spot. Not on the spot in a mean way or a threatening way, in a good way. You know more about the issue than they do. And when you go in as voters to talk to them, you know, they're going to listen. And if they don't listen, they shouldn't be in there in the first place and vote them out. But you have to change them. You got to remember that a member of Congress, a senator, they've got something like 20,000 issues before them every year. They got people that are coming in that are top lobbyists that are paid a lot of money. Lobbyists for the poor are very few. Matter of fact, they're not paid a lot of money, and there aren't enough of them, and there's not a lot of representation for the poor. So that's where they need you. Government needs to do more, and I think that they can. I really do, but I don't think we should ever give up on that. But are they the answer? No, they're part of the answer. All the programs that I started in Dayton, Ohio, they're all private. And I loved them, and they represented, and they built a constituency. But the government sometimes can lead when sometimes the people are a little bit sensitive, or they're a little bit shy, or they're not bold. Great example. Ohio had the only river that I know of that caught on fire by itself. The Cuyahoga County River. And you remember that show Laugh-In? I think it was featured on that. You know, you can fish out of that river today, and you can catch the fish and eat the fish. And that took the government going in, the EPA, and really finding out who the polluters are, and charging them, and they threatened, and they took a lot of them to court. The government did that. Businesses should have done it, but they didn't. They should have policed themselves, but the government did that. And we need the government sometimes to push, to be bold. And the other thing I find is that people, especially students and people want to be led. They're looking for leaders. They want to follow. They want to believe. They want to believe that this person is sincere. And I think the students today are ripe. I think you can build an army that change this country. And you don't need a lot. I've often said when I'm in a group of 100 students, if I get 2 out of that group, I'll beat you every day. I'll build an army on those 2 kids. And I will start things that will make some things happen. All you need to do is touch a few, and you can build an army from those few.
I was just wondering, Tony, you said that there's not many lobbyists for the poor, but there's a lot of private giving these days with the Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett and so forth. I wonder if it wouldn't be wise to use some of those funds to get some type of lobbying group, particularly for the baby boom generation that's starting to retire, to bring the awareness, because I agree with you, if the awareness was there, people would really react to it. So it needs a PR campaign or something. I mean, Bono's out with his hat in his hand, but somebody's got to get an organized effort for that.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. I mean, some of that money should go for that. And you know, that we have a lot of retired people that are very bright, very smart, very experienced, that could be great lobbyists. And they don't have to be retired people, but we're not using a lot of our resources that we have available to us. Yes, sir.
You said that education and awareness are very important tools to reach people who could be of help to the poor. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who has access to public school children, and whether or not reaching this category of people would mean treading on dangerous grounds in terms of trying to bring them, making them aware of the situations outside our own country and in our own country? with a little tinge of, faith, belief in the public schools? Is that a little dangerous?
I don't think it's a problem in a lot of schools, especially in some of your southern states. It's pretty easy. I was in a southern college the other day, and I couldn't believe the faith and the things that the coaches were doing and the teachers and the professors. It was staggering to me how strong they were, how forceful they were about faith and about roots and about foundation. And I said, if you ever did that in Ohio, in my state, they'd probably get taken to court. But I think what you can do in public schools, and we started this in Dayton, and I was part of this, is teaching values, especially in public schools. And when you teach values, honesty, integrity, ethics, the foundation, you can talk about where the foundation of those things come from. And when you do things, when you start programs to help people, people always want to know, why do you do this? And it doesn't matter if you're in a church or synagogue or a public school, tell them, I did it because, I don't have a problem. I tell them because of my faith. I tell them because I love Jesus. I love God. And he's changed my life in so many, many ways. I can't talk enough about him. How can anybody argue with you on that? It's what I feel. It's my belief. And I think you can do that any place. Now, you can't force it down people's throats. I learned my first lesson about this from my wife, because both of us were the same when we first went to Washington. We were not believers. We didn't know God. And I became a believer a year before she did. And every Sunday I would get up my first year in Congress, I would go out and search, and I would go to a different church every Sunday, and my wife said, "What's wrong with you?" She said, "Are you crazy?" I said, "Well, I'm hunting for God, but I'm not quite sure what I'm hunting for." And then I found him, and now I became a zealot. I was really a nutcase. And I tried to shove it down my wife's throat. And for 6 months, I said to her, "Now, Jan, would you like to pray tonight?" Or I might say, "Jan, would you like to receive Jesus tonight?" Well, this went over like a lead balloon, And she got so mad. And my friends would come over. I didn't even have any friends that knew God. This is how far away from faith I was. My friend would come over and say, "Tony, what's new?" I said, "You're not going to believe this, but I love Jesus." And they'd say, "Oh, geez." My wife would kick me under the desk or under the table, and I tell you, my shins are still sore from that. She kicked me so many times. Well, what happened was, after 6 months of trying and praying and pushing my wife and preaching, I was going nowhere. And then I stopped. And for 6 months, I said nothing. And she became a believer. I said, "Now, wait a minute. How did all this happen?" She said, "When you stopped preaching and stopped pushing, and I saw your life change towards me, the children, towards your job," I said, "there had to be something to this God thing." I said, "I really bought into it." And that's how she taught me my first lesson. You cannot shove faith down people's throats. And every place I go, whether it's in these 120 nations, we pray with Muslims, we pray with Buddhists, we pray with Hindus, we work on reconciliation, we bring programs in there. And, I've not been thrown out of a country yet. And most times when we go, because of that passage in 1 Thessalonians where Paul says, when we came, we had power, we had the Holy Spirit, and we had true conviction. This works. As I get older, the most interesting things about the scriptures are the very simple things that God says. Love your enemy. Go 2 by 2. Pray. Over and over again, these simple verses. And a problem is sometimes we try to intellectualize things. We go like this, we miss everything. But the simple truths of God are so wonderful, so beautiful if we just do them.
Tony, will you tell us a little bit about the World Food Program and the work you did? I think it's been an interesting week for the UN in the lives of Americans. And I think there's a lot of confusion about what the UN does and what the World Food Program does and some of the work that you've done recently. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I just finished being the ambassador to the UN organizations, food and agriculture organizations in Rome, and that includes the World Food Program, FAO, IFAD, and related industries. And these are related agencies. We actually have 3 ambassadors in Rome. We have an ambassador to the country, our bilateral ambassador. We have an ambassador to the Holy See, and then an ambassador to the UN. It's one of the few cities in the world where we have more than one ambassador. And my job was to represent our country and our aid. And what the president asked me to do is, he said it this clearly. He said, I want you to go and feed the people of the world and bring hope. I said, is that all you want me to do? I mean, this is a lot. But it might surprise you that the World Food Program is the largest humanitarian organization in the world. It's located in Rome. They feed about 110 million people in the world every year. And the United States has 50% of that. We give 50% of all the aid, all the food, all the money. And the rest of the world gives the other 50%. Now, if you're to read about how ungenerous the United States is overseas, they forget to look at those statistics. The largest humanitarian organization in the world, we give half, and the rest of the world gives the other half. So I represented that money and that food, and I also represented trying to be a good steward of our money. And I would travel around the world to where we had given that food and money to be sure that we were proper stewards of it. FAO is, and the World Food Program is the best way to describe them is that they are an emergency UN agency. They are the logistical arm of all of the UN. They're the ones that have the trucks, the planes, the boats that are delivering everything, at the same time delivering humanitarian aid. But they also do school feeding. They do a lot of work with HIV/AIDS. And then there's FAO, which is the food and agriculture, and they do everything from fisheries to food safety to forestry. Then IFAD, which is a much smaller UN agency that deals very similar to microenterprise, but they're a much larger, there's much larger kinds of loans. And that was a great job for me because I got to represent, I think, one of the best things that the United States does. And a lot of people, even in our own country, don't realize how much aid that we do give. Now, is it enough? Can we give more? Yes. We can give a lot more. But we already give 50%. We'd like other nations to give more. But let me tell you about foreign aid, in my opinion, especially this kind of aid. And I can give you a couple stories about North Korea. At one time, for the first 3 years that we were in North Korea, out of the last 6 years, we gave 85% of everything. 85% of whatever is going in that country came from the United States. And I went there 6 times. The first time I went there, they didn't want to talk to me. They never see Americans. I would walk into a public school there, and there would be posters of American GIs bayoneting North Korean children. I mean, the kinds of things that they would say about us and demonstrate the lies that were told about us were unbelievable, and they never thanked me for the food or anything. But on every bag of food that we sent in North Korea, we put the flag of the United States on it. And in the Korean language, we said, donated by the people of the United States. We got 10 million bags now in North Korea that people are using as suitcases. You will, as you're going down the street in villages, people have these United States feed bags with their food and their articles and their clothes. I mean, these bags are made out of very strong burlap and hemp. I mean, they're very, very good bags. And one of the best advertisers for the United States is what we're doing in North Korea. When I went back my 5th time to North Korea, I would walk by and people would stand at attention and salute me and thank me for the food because I was representing the United States. Couldn't believe the change. Now, we have a problem with the government of North Korea. We don't have a problem with the people of North Korea. We should feed them. We should reach out to them. We should love them. And you know what? Someday, those bags will pay off. The answer to terrorism is not humanitarian aid, but it's part of the answer. And we can do more. I was with a man in Pakistan. I said, why do you send your son to that school that teaches hate about the United States and Western nations? He said, I send my son there not because I like what they teach, but because I can't afford to send him any other place. They feed him, they give him clothes, and they give him a place to stay. So we now compete with that. We now give a lot of our food aid to public schools to get the kids back in the school. School feeding is one of the best things we do. You want to fight against terrorism? We can fight with our humanitarian aid. We don't necessarily have to give a speech, but we can also show a sermon, what's good about the United States. It's one of the best things that we can do, and it works. Humanitarian aid is wonderful, and it buys a lot of tremendous public will, and it keeps a lot of people alive. I'll never forget when I was in Italy with Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister Berlusconi. He came on television one day, and it was a time when we were coming under a lot of attacks. They were trying to poison our water supply and our embassies, a lot of problems. And he got on television, he said to the Italians, I don't want you to ever forget. I don't want you to ever forget Americans. Because after the war, if it wasn't for the Marshall Plan, we wouldn't have eaten. As a matter of fact, he was a recipient of the Marshall Plan, the Prime Minister. So our foreign aid works, but we need to do a lot more of it.
I'd like to ask you a question in which that you kind of relate your United Nations work with your work as a U.S. Congressman. I worked for 15 years directing an NGO in Africa. And I hear in recent years a growing number of voices within the NGO community in Africa saying, we've been getting food or funding from USAID, USDA, but we really want to start getting our food and funding from World Food Program, European Union, from other donors. And the reason is the perception within the NGO community that the U.S. Congress is attaching so many bureaucratic strings to USAID channeled aid that it's becoming increasingly difficult to get anything done. So in order to run a USAID supported program, you have to get Billman certification that you're not doing a counter incentive to indigenous food production, and environmental certification that you're not damaging the environment, an A133 audit, which is not like a regular financial audit, but which is hugely consumes huge amount of management time and energy, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And even that the Congress changes the legislative mandate every year so much that by the time USAID staff can get around to sorting out what the rules are, the guidelines that they issue on the reports we're supposed to file don't come to us until after the reports are already due. And so I find people saying, we'd like to work with the UN, which is less bureaucratic, which is an amazing thing to say, that the UN could be less bureaucratic than anything. Obviously, all of those things that the Congress has put into the legislative mandate to USAID were motivated by good. We're concerned about the environment. We don't want counter incentives to indigenous food production. We don't want financial mismanagement, et cetera, et cetera. But there seems to be a problem, and I hear a growing chorus of voices in the NGO community saying, I wonder if we can find funding and food support from somewhere other than the U.S. government. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, two things are happening. Number one, it is true that Congress is very guilty of earmarks. We have a tendency to all think that we're the next Secretary of State, so we want to keep adding amendments to bills and et cetera. And also at the same time, the budget for AID is being cut. And but I would ask one question of you. When's the last time you went to your congressman or senator and told them this?
Well, in fact, I did share this with a friend of yours, Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey, and he was very sensitive to the concern.
And you're going to see him again next year?
Yeah, I see him about it.
He needs to hear it over and over and over, because Chris Smith is a good man, and Chris Smith is a very, very strong proponent of foreign aid. And the members of Congress really don't know of the, they're not really thinking about the strings and the problems they put on USAID. And it is true. They will earmark, they will cause you more problems. On the other hand, we're giving more and more aid to the World Food Program than we ever did. And the reason is that the World Food Program is probably today the finest UN agency we have. It's a great agency. And I know a lot of people don't say that about UN agencies, but I've known them all. And this is run very well. It's very efficient, very effective. They have a great leader, an American by the name of Jim Morris. He has a good team. He's very business-oriented the way he presents it. They get good value for the dollar. And almost half of our food aid now goes through the World Food Program. Half that we put out in the world goes through the World Food Program. And a lot of that has to do, why do we go through the UN? We go through the UN because many of these countries we're in, Sudan, North Korea, the Congo, Zimbabwe, we don't have relationships with the government. And we're not going to give our money or food to the government. We stopped that many years ago. We don't believe in that because it's going to get stolen and it's going to go into the wrong hands. So what we do is we give it through the World Food Program, and the World Food Program is run very, very well. And that's why we give it to them, because they're nonpartisan. Because Zimbabwe, I mean, this guy, Mugabe, I mean, he's terrible. The leadership in North Korea, terrible. But you know what? The people of the Congo and Darfur and North Korea, they're not my enemy, and they're not the enemy of the people of the United States, regardless of what our politicians say. We give food aid and help to them, but never to the government.
I just wondered, Tony, if you could comment why it's so difficult to wrestle money from the Defense Department. If the Defense Department is anywhere from $500 billion, and if you count pensions and everything, could be upwards almost of $1 trillion on an annual basis versus maybe $25 billion going to humanitarian aid. Why is it so difficult to convince the Congress and the Senate to sell, love and peace instead of war and hate?
You mean you don't believe the MX missile was called the Peacekeeper is really a peacekeeper? It's a good question, and it's not an easy question. It's from the standpoint of people that have military bases in their own districts, and they have businesses that grow up around those military bases, and they have people that are employed by those military bases. And it's sometimes very, very difficult. I have voted against my own military base, and it's not fun. It's not fun at all.
I guess
because you will hear from your constituency in a big way. And that's what keeps it alive.
I guess the question then comes, what's the economics of peace? If you have all the soldiers and all the military contractors and everything else that are employing all these people, if these guys stop building ships and bombs and planes and everything else like that, what are you going to do with them? I mean, I don't know.
Well, the
That's one of
economics
biggest
of peace is, it's always been shown, and things that I have read and are part of, is that your expenditure per capita by the Defense Department is never as good as in peaceful times at all. You just save a lot more money when it's in the humanitarian sector, and your money goes a lot further.
Right, just think if you were selling peace and love, you wouldn't have to spend all that money in defense at the end of the day.
Would you just reflect briefly about the relationship of the kinds of things you were talking about, you were doing, which I heard primarily as being a very important distribution work of aid to the poor, and the kinds of things that we were talking, say, this morning about microfinance or possibly other forms of stimulating, encouraging, creating environments of producing wealth and elevating folks out of the poverty. Could you just connect the two for us from your angle, how you see it?
Well, one of the things I want to connect with is what, a lot of people have talked about Opportunity International. I'm connected with them too. And after I retired for 40 years, I'm trying to help them as well. And it's a wonderful organization. And what's good about microfinance and microcredit is that the money never dies. The money grows. And if it's a good program like in Nicaragua, we gave them $2 million out of USAID funds, and that $2 million now is up to $8 million. It just keeps growing because as people pay it back, and they make more loans, and it comes back and back. Microfinance is one of the best things I've seen. So many of the programs that you're involved with, even though like school feeding, basic education, teaching of mothers about reading and writing, immunization, these are tremendous programs, but you don't oftentimes get to see the end result. With microfinance, you do get to see the end result. The other thing about what I was talking earlier about, and I hope this is what you're talking about, is that we have a big job to do. We not only need more political will in this country, we need more spiritual will, and we don't have that. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. We don't. This issue belongs to people of faith. It belongs to us, and we should take it, and we should build our army, and we should go forward with it, and we're not doing it. The political aspects I've talked about, and we can change that, but we have to become more advocates. We have to become more pushy. We have to put our politicians on the spot. We have to demand that they start doing the kinds of things that you want them to do. They will listen. You show me a politician that won't listen, and I'll show you a person that if he or she gets that reputation, they're not going to last very long. I want you to remember one thing about them, too. I started to tell you about how busy they are. If you ever see a congressman or a senator, they're on several subcommittees. They're going from this committee to that committee. Their aides are whispering in their ear. They can't focus on what's really before the committee because in 5 minutes they're going to have to go do a press conference, or they're going to have to meet so-and-so and so-and-so, or have a lunch, or do this, or there's a vote coming up. So they are reading what the aide is giving them, and he or she, they're shoving this in front of the senator's face or at the subcommittee room, and he's reading what his aide just read or just wrote. And they don't have a chance to focus. And the only way, and so the people that are taking their time are all these lobbyists that are paid to come in and take their time. And they're also spending a heck of a lot of time getting reelected, raising money. Most members of Congress spend 2 or 3 hours a day raising money. From the day they get elected, they raise money. This is ridiculous. You want to change a law that we ought to change, we should have public financing of congressional campaigns. I know a lot of Republicans don't like that, but what money is doing to Congress today is absolutely killing our political system. I mean, it's legal, it's almost legal prostitution, the amount of money it costs to raise, to run in an office today. I think to be a member of the Congress, I'm getting off the subject, I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but to run for Congress today, House of Representatives, it takes about $850 million average. That was the average spent last time. Last time I ran, I wanted to prove to my colleagues and to my good friend Frank Wolf that you don't have to spend much money to get elected, because if you're known, why should you spend all this money? Well, they have a feeling because the population changes every 3.5 years, you have to constantly be before the people. So you must spend a minimum of $400,000 to keep your name out there through signs, advertisements, radio, TV, etc. So in my last campaign, I said, both of us had nominal opposition. We should beat them without a problem. And Frank says, and two other friends said, but Frank, he said, I got to spend $400,000 because, you know, if I don't get a certain percentage, they'll come after me the next time. I said, I'm not going to spend a dime. I'm not going to buy a sign. I'm not going to have a brochure. I'm not going to have one radio spot or TV spot. And he's going to spend $400,000. Well, the election came. He got 84% of the vote. I got 83%. I said, your 1% costs $400,000. Now, I had been around a while. I had been an incumbent, so it was easier for me. But the fact is, you have to put a stop to this. They're not going to stop doing this. And they're not going to stop this negative campaigning until you say no. And you have to demand that they stop this. You have to make it very difficult on them. And you've got a lot of different groups that you can do this with. Your church groups, your faith-based groups, your League of Women Voters groups. This is killing us. This is killing us as a democracy, the amount of money that we spend to get our people elected. And I didn't mean to get off on that, but sorry. They wanted me to run for senator 3 years ago, 4 years ago in Ohio. I looked at it, and I had to raise $12 million in order to possibly win. And then even if I raised the $12 million, it was not clear whether I could win or not. I'm not interested. And this is where we are today. Almost every congressman and senator, especially members of Congress, they have to spend 2 or 3 hours a day on the phone raising money. They do. So you want to know why you don't get their attention? You want to get their attention? You got to go see them. You want to change their heart? You got to show your program to them. You want them to develop passion? Take them overseas. Sponsor a trip. Go with them. They will change. And if they don't change, well, they don't have much of a heart.
I think I'm probably following up on an issue which was raised earlier, because that's the issue I was trying to bring. For me, this has been an important meeting with the congressman, and thank you for your presence here. Pushing the issue of military spending a little bit more, because I'm also interested in the ripple effect that military spending has on other nations in terms of trying to keep up with each other, and how much that takes away from a lot of social spending. You have access to the halls of power. I just want to know your views on how you view that. I know there's a political issue, and you rightly brought it in terms of districts and senatorial districts also having military bases, and they contribute a lot, both in terms of finance and personal and votes. But there's a larger issue involved, because along with educating people about hunger, isn't there a possibility to educate people also about peace issues, which can then lessen the pressure on elected representatives to keep on voting for more money on military? Because I think it ripples in other countries too. So just your views on that.
We haven't offered alternatives to the defense budget. We feed 110 million people in this world every year, but there are 810 million people that are hungry. We're getting at 10% of the people. 10% of the people. What part of the foreign aid that I'm talking about is part of our budget? It's about 1/2 of 1%. And there is no alternative. We haven't offered it yet. There's no political party that's come forward. They need leadership. It takes leadership, and it takes maybe, with what one of the men said here today, maybe some of these foundations providing some money to pay some very, very good lobbyists to lobby Congress just like everybody else lobbies, just like a tax lawyer goes down there and lobbies Congress. And these guys, they get the members' attention because they got money. They got money and they have campaign funds. And the politicians listen to them and they take up all their time. But somebody coming down there that doesn't have a political PAC, doesn't have any money, he's lucky to get in to see an aide. And until you give him an alternative, until you compete with them on that level, not compete as far as money, but compete as far as lobbying, you're not going to beat this military-industrial complex. They're organized, they're tough, they're strong, they got plenty of money, and members of Congress listen to them.
I want to just thank you. I feel like we've had the opportunity to have a coaching session for how to make a difference on behalf of our faith in a democracy with someone who knows the inside.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that, and I appreciate your wisdom, and I appreciate you just being real with us about your experiences and about what we all care about and are gathered here to address. So thank you very much. You know, it makes me think of what Jesus and the disciples said when this Canaanite woman kept coming after them. They said, "She keeps shouting at us." And would that our elected officials in Washington say that about us coming on behalf of issues of hunger and poverty. So, yeah. At this point, I'm going to invite David Miller, the executive director of the Center for Faith and Culture, to come up, and Scott Smith as well, son of Sarah Smith and a member of the Center's advisory board, to conclude the conference for us.
Let Scott share a word first, please.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming. My late mother would be very, very pleased with this. The speakers we've had have all been really interesting, and I think what's interesting about this subject of poverty is that one of the things that's become clear to me from hearing from all the speakers is that it's really more than just the simple way we think about it in terms of a poverty of economics. It's really the poverty of trust and the poverty of lack of skills and the poverty of kind of a self-belief in ourself that really get to the core of solving the issue of poverty. It's not just about money. And you know, I think one of the really interesting things that Colin said is we all think about, you know, the crumbs from the table. There are two ways to think about it. It's either a crumb or it's a seed. And that really is that very simple concept of, do we not have hope or do we have hope? And really what these conferences are about is the concept of moral leadership. And in some ways, we're all leaders in our different communities. And that's what's interesting. We come from the worlds of politics and the worlds of religion and the worlds of business. And we have the opportunity to exercise leadership. And that's really about doing something. And in some ways, you know, we've been talking very globally about the global problems and the things that are going on in foreign countries. But a lot of it also starts at home, kind of like with Mother Teresa. It's do what's in front of you. And we all have the opportunity to teach that child a new skill or give someone the trust in an institution that they can raise themselves out of some sort of poverty, whether it's an economic poverty or a poverty of self-confidence. And so I think it's been a really enlightening conference, and I appreciate all of you coming, and I hope that in the next days and weeks and years we can all kind of exercise our own leadership in some ways to help solve this problem of poverty. So thank you especially to the speakers, and also I want to particularly thank Chris Sharon, who's really made this happen and put this together. He's been in charge of all the programming and lining up the wonderful speakers and getting all of us here together. So if you could join me in thanking Chris, I'd really appreciate it.
This is a real Bible. It's my privilege to close the conference. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. That's what we've been talking about. Crumbs from the table. The question before us, notice our posters had a question mark after that. Crumbs from the table. That's not sufficient, is it? Just as that woman knew, and just as we know. How to recap this marvelous conference? I feel a bit like that old movie Around the World in 90 Days. Bear with me a moment as I try to give a vignette of what we've just done in these past 18 hours. Miroslav opened, framing the conference with the quote, "Immense wealth is created, yet abject poverty persists." Why, he asked. Well, it's not just an issue of inadequate generosity or inefficient distribution channels. He suggested there was a problem of inadequate giving and receiving, a theological question and a theological answer. Vinay Samuel then gave us a marvelous opening keynote last night, giving us 5 theological themes that lead him to believe that enterprise solutions are a big part of the solution. He talked about creation, covenant, both with God and with neighbor, a reconciliation as done through Jesus Christ on the cross, neighbor alongside neighbor, a distinctive Christian understanding of neighborliness and neighborhood, and all of that guided, inspired, and led by the Holy Spirit. And like Dale said later, he reminded us that the problem of wealth is one that occurs when our own daily needs are too easily met and we get distant from and forget God. We, the wealthy, have our own problem. We were reminded of spiritual capital that the poor have and a generosity that the poor have that make we, the wealthy, very embarrassed. And that micro-enterprise leads to more than just crumbs from the table, but it leads to self-esteem, trust, neighborliness, and a theme of mutuality was teed off. Well, this morning, Colin Timms reminded us, contrary to that movie, Show Me the Money, It's more than just money. Enterprise solutions indeed are helpful. They build self-confidence. They break a cycle of poverty. But he also reminds us soberly it will take a generation or two for the fruits to be seen and the patterns to be systematically changed. He reminded us that loans alone, while necessary as the start, don't solve the problem, that enterprise skills are needed too, so that incomes and profits can be reinvested and not just consumed. And he even shared himself the question that many business people, I suspect, in this room or others, wonder of the double life we lead, that of our business life, our professional life, and how we often try to atone, if you will, through our charitable and philanthropic activities. I wonder, can we not use God's presence in and through our work, as Tony mentioned at the end? Then Chris Sharon, the organizer, the colleague, the teammate, became the pastor and led us in the Word, reminding us of the urgency of this issue and the dignity of impatience. The panel, masterfully moderated by Ted Malik, took us through an erudite set of thoughts from Professor Gus Reines, one of our economists here at Yale, Gary Moore with his marvelous Kentucky common sense, but experience of advising the likes of Sir John Templeton and being with orphans in Uganda also brought a certain honesty and earthiness to the discussion. Dale Hansen Burke, another great friend of the center, brought a human face to the discussion and reminded us of the link of mutuality and, as a fellow Presbyterian, our problem with Presbyterian prosperity gospel. She also reminded me, not quite your words, Dale, but we need to overcome the they syndrome, this we and they, but no, it's an us. And again, of course, Vinay and Colin added wonderful thoughts, and Susan also brought a ground-level perspective, having been there and indeed done that of which we speak. Well, Tony, you had to go to Congress to find God. You shared an incredible testimony to us in more ways than one, literally and figuratively. Tony, I think, embodied how personal passion matters, how the call of God comes to us, and how we can bring God, yes, into the workplace in gentle and effective and welcoming ways. That's something we all can do, not someone else. We don't have to go join an NGO. We could do it in and where we are now, in addition to the work we do with NGOs and the government. Quote, I wanted my life to count and to demonstrate my faith, unquote. People talk about what we might put on our tombstones. That's not a bad one. Not that I'm encouraging you to go in that direction, Tony. He also said, I'd rather see a sermon than say one. I think we've seen a sermon these past 12 to 18 hours. Well, if there's an organizing principle, something that ties this all together, of course, it's the theme, isn't it? It's the title you saw on the posters, this wonderful piece of art. Crumbs from the table, question mark, the creation of wealth and the persistence of poverty. 3 themes I noticed throughout the talks, not planned, but they seem to emerge. One is a sociological one, that there's an overcoming of the polarities. To do this, to do the will of Christ, the claim on us as Christians, we have to overcome the polarities of we, they, rich, poor, you, me. And it was embodied in words like mutuality, neighborliness, coming together, an eschatological vision, if you will, as our colleague Miroslav will often talk about. But maybe, just maybe, we can approximate that in the here and now. So if there's a sociological theme of overcoming polarities, the theological theme, not quite articulated, I believe, but using my words, I would say that we're to be co-creators with God, where we have both rights and responsibilities as children created in the image of God. And implied in that is a deep sense of covenant theology, certainly with God, our Creator and Lord, but also with each other as neighbor. And of course, those who are followers of Jesus will see all this wrapped up in a reconciled world initially done through Jesus Christ and the cross, and then manifested, hopefully, in our day-to-day living. Well, finally, there's a practical or third theme I saw, and that's this interdisciplinary nature. No, the politicians cannot do it alone. No, the pastors cannot do it alone. No, the clergy, the theologians, the business people, the NGOs. No, we all need each other. The rich and the poor, we need each other. The poor themselves have to be part of this. They have a face. We heard and saw some of them. They have ideas. They have other forms of capital to bring to the table. The rich, bankers and bakers, yes, you and me, all of us. To conclude, let me first make the comment, for those of you who have your Palm Pilots and diaries and so forth, next year, save the date. In your packets, you saw this wonderful little card. Note that September 20th and 21st of next year, we'll be convening here again, and the theme, I think one that will only become more important, is security, vulnerability, and risk. Security, vulnerability, and risk. And again, we will be thinking about it in an interdisciplinary fashion, drawing on the insights of theology, politics, the marketplace, academics, and practitioners. Second, just before my closing word, I think we should start with the way we began, and that's with a great word of thanks. First, let me thank all of you who came out of busy lives, deep pressures in your day-to-day living. You spent money to come here. I thank all the speakers, needless to say, and not just for your hours today, but for your lives of dedication, which brought you to the place to share so much today. And certainly Chris and Lucinda and the team, Sven, and all the other countless folks on the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, we thank you. We thank our dean, and we thank the school for its support. And certainly the Smith family, as has been noticed. Let me conclude with a charge. Just as the woman challenged Jesus, which takes a bit of chutzpah to do, and just as Tony challenged us, what we need is not more political will, what we need is more spiritual will, and that this issue belongs to us, particularly us as followers of Jesus. I challenge you to take up that charge of Tony's, to develop more spiritual will. And I challenge you and me to be co-creators with God and help turn crumbs from the table into an abundant banquet where all are welcome, all are fed, and where all are reconciled in Jesus Christ. Thank you, and go in peace.